The cold was a physical thing. It was not merely an absence of warmth, but an active, malevolent presence that sank its teeth into the frozen mud of the town's single street and laid a brittle, crystalline shroud over everything. It crept through the gaps in the warped timbers of the general store. It stole the breath from the lungs of horses tied to the hitching posts, and it settled deep in the bones of a woman who stood with her back to its merciless wind. She was a study in displacement, a figure drawn in shades of gray against the stark white of the landscape. Her coat was thin, a garment made for a different season in a different, more forgiving place. It offered as much protection from the cold as a prayer might against a landslide. She had been standing there for what felt like an eternity, watching the town's occupants move with a purpose she could not share. They scurried from the warmth of one building to another, heads bowed, their faces obscured by scarves and the steam of their own breath. No one looked at her. To them, she was already a ghost, a specter of poverty and desperation they chose not to see. Inside the pocket of her coat, her fingers worried the last object of value she owned in the world. It was a small, silver locket, tarnished and light, its delicate chain knotted into an impossible tangle. It was not enough. She had already learned that. The storekeeper had looked at it, then at her, and his eyes, small and hard as river stones, had offered no charity. From the opposite side of the street, a man watched her. He stood in the deep shadow of the livery stable, a solid, deliberate shape against the blowing snow. He was a man made of the same harsh elements as the land itself. His face was weathered, carved by wind and sun into a mask of stoic endurance. He had seen her enter the store and seen her exit moments later, her shoulders held with a rigid pride that did little to conceal the tremor of defeat that ran through her. He had seen the storekeeper's dismissive wave, the turning of a back. He had seen it all before. This town had a short memory for kindness and a long one for hardship. He knew what she was, a stray, another soul washed up on the unforgiving shores of this frontier, stripped of everything but the will to draw one more ragged breath. He had his own emptiness to contend with, a silence in his cabin that was becoming too loud to bear, a hollowness carved out by loss that the changing seasons could not fill. He watched her for a long time, his gaze quiet and searching. He was not measuring her beauty or her frailty, but her substance. He saw the way she straightened her spine against a gust of wind that should have buckled her, the way her chin lifted in a gesture of useless defiance. He saw a flicker of iron beneath the desperation. He crossed the street. His boots made no sound in the fresh powder. He stopped a few feet from her, close enough to block the wind, but far enough not to crowd her. She flinched when he spoke, her eyes, the color of a winter sky just before a storm, widening with a fear she quickly suppressed. "You have no place to go," he said. It was not a question. She said nothing. Her silence was an answer in itself, a wall of pride she was too weary to maintain for much longer. "I have a proposition," he continued, his voice as rough and steady as the land he worked. "It is not an offer of charity. It is a contract." He paused, letting the words settle in the frigid air between them. "I need a wife. My son needs a mother. The work is hard and the location is isolated. In return, you will have a roof over your head, food in your belly, and my protection. There will be no other expectations." Her gaze flickered over his face, searching for a trick, a lie, some hidden cruelty. She found nothing but a profound weariness that mirrored her own. "A wife?" she whispered, the word a plume of white vapor that vanished almost instantly. "A housekeeper and a caretaker for a child, under the legal protection of a marriage certificate," he clarified, his tone brutally pragmatic. "The storm will be here by nightfall. It will be a bad one. The town will not take you in. You have until I load my wagon to decide." He did not wait for her response. He turned and walked toward his wagon, his movements economical and sure. He did not look back. The choice was hers, but it was the kind of choice a drowning person has when offered a single, splintered plank. It was no choice at all. She watched him lift a heavy sack of flour as if it were a child's toy, his strength a raw and undeniable fact. She looked down the empty street, at the indifferent windows of the town, and felt the cold seeping past her skin, reaching for her heart. She took a deep breath, the air so cold it burned, and walked toward the wagon. She walked toward the only door that had opened. The journey to the homestead was made in a silence as vast and profound as the snow-covered plains that stretched out on all sides. The world had been reduced to the creak of the wagon wheels, the rhythmic plodding of the horses, and the ceaseless sigh of the wind. He had given her a heavy wool blanket, stiff and smelling of horse and hay, and she had wrapped it around herself, a meager fortress against the encroaching cold. She sat on the hard wooden bench, a passenger in a life that was no longer her own, her gaze fixed on the endless expanse of white. He handled the reins with a quiet competence, his attention focused on the barely visible track ahead. He did not speak to her, did not even look at her. She was a necessity he had acquired, a piece of living cargo to be transported. When the homestead finally emerged from the swirling snow, it looked less like a home and more like an outpost against the wilderness. It was a simple, sturdy cabin built of dark, weathered logs, with a plume of smoke rising from a stone chimney in a thin, gray line. A barn and a few smaller outbuildings stood nearby, hunkered down against the land as if for protection. The place felt profoundly isolated, a tiny island of human endeavor in an ocean of raw, untamed nature. There was a stark, brutal simplicity to it, a sense of function over comfort that spoke volumes about the man who lived there. Inside, the cabin was a single large room, meticulously clean but profoundly empty. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a fire already laid and waiting for a match. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs stood in the center, and a small, curtained-off area likely served as a sleeping space. The air was cold and still. It was the home of a man who did not live in it so much as occupy it, a shelter from the elements, and nothing more. The silence within its walls was different from the silence of the plains. It was heavier, weighted with unspoken things. It was then that she saw the boy. He was sitting on a small stool by the hearth, so still she had almost missed him. He was small for his age, perhaps 5 or 6, with his father's dark hair and a solemn, watchful expression in his wide, dark eyes. He did not smile or greet them. He simply watched her, his gaze unwavering and unerringly perceptive, as if he were trying to read the story of her entire life in the lines of her weary face. The rancher moved to the fireplace and struck a match. The dry kindling caught with a hungry whoosh, and flames began to lick at the larger logs. He did not introduce her or explain her presence to the child. He moved to the small cooking area, pulling a cast-iron pot from a hook. He prepared a simple meal of salted pork and beans, his movements efficient and stripped of any unnecessary gesture. When it was ready, he ladled it into 2 bowls and placed them on the table. He gestured for her to sit. She ate with a hunger that shamed her, the hot food a shock to her system. She had not realized how close to starvation she had been. Across the table, the man ate slowly, methodically. The boy took his own small bowl and returned to his stool by the fire, eating in the same unnerving silence. The only sounds were the scrape of spoons against pottery and the crackle of the fire. The meal felt less like a shared supper and more like the feeding of an animal that had been brought in from the cold. It highlighted the immense gulf between their states of being. He was the provider, the master of this small, stark world, and she was the supplicant, the recipient of a begrudging sustenance. When they were finished, he took her bowl and washed it with a practiced economy of motion. He then led her to a small, curtainless room that had been added to the side of the main cabin. It contained a narrow cot with a thin mattress and a single, neatly folded blanket. A small window looked out onto the endless, snow-swept darkness. "This is your room," he said, his voice flat. "The boy sleeps in a loft above the main room. I sleep there," he pointed to the curtained-off alcove. "You will not be disturbed." He turned to leave, then paused in the doorway. "The boy's name is Cody. He does not speak. Not since his mother, not for a year now. Your job is to care for him and the house. That is all." He closed the door, leaving her alone in the stark, cold room. The kindness of the meal and the shelter felt as sharp and dangerous as the winter itself, a debt she could never hope to repay. She sank onto the cot, the weight of her new reality settling upon her. She was safe, she was fed, but she was a prisoner in a cage of quiet grief, bound to a silent man and a silent child. The days that followed fell into a silent, unvarying rhythm. The rancher would rise before dawn, his movements quiet but purposeful in the main room. By the time she emerged from her small chamber, He would be gone, ventured out into the biting cold to tend to the duties of his isolated kingdom. He would not return until dusk, his face etched with fatigue, smelling of the cold and the animals he tended. He would eat the simple meal she prepared in the same stoic silence, his presence filling the small cabin with a heavy, unreadable energy. Her world shrank to the four walls of the cabin and the watchful, silent presence of the boy. Cody was her shadow, a ghost who flitted at the edges of her vision. He watched her knead bread, his dark eyes following the movement of her hands. He watched her sweep the rough plank floors, his small form perched on his stool by the fire. He never spoke, never made a sound. His silence was a tangible thing, a wall he had built around himself that she did not know how to breach. She spoke to him sometimes, her voice soft and tentative in the oppressive quiet, telling him about the city she had come from, about the birds that sang in the parks in springtime. He would listen, his head cocked slightly, but his expression never changed. She worked tirelessly, driven by a desperate need to prove her worth, to earn her keep. She scrubbed the floors until they shone, mended the boys' worn clothes with neat, careful stitches, and cooked meals that were nourishing and warm. She tried to bring a touch of life to the stark cabin, arranging a handful of dried winter grasses in a jar on the table. The house seemed to resist her efforts, swallowing her small gestures into its vast, grieving emptiness. The rancher never commented on her work, but she would sometimes see his gaze linger on the mended seam of his son's shirt or the neatly stacked firewood, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes before the mask of indifference slipped back into place. One morning, the relentless snow finally subsided, leaving the world buried under a thick, pristine blanket of white. The silence that followed the storm was even more profound. Late in the afternoon, a sharp, cracking sound echoed from near the barn, followed by a low, frustrated curse from the rancher. She looked out her small window to see him standing by the well, staring down at the frozen mechanism of the water pump. The handle hung at a useless angle. It was broken. She watched him work on it for the better part of an hour, his movements growing increasingly agitated. He was a man of immense physical strength, but the delicate, frozen gears of the pump required a different kind of touch. She pulled on her thin coat and the worn boots he had left for her, and stepped out into the blinding, sunlit snow. The cold was a shock, a slap in the face. He heard her approach and turned, his expression hardening. "Go back inside," he ordered, his voice sharp. "This is not your concern." "I can help," she said, her voice steady despite the cold that was already seeping into her bones. She would not be a sheltered pet, a useless mouth to feed. This was a statement, not a plea. He gave a short, humorless laugh. "And what would you know about this?" Instead of answering, she moved closer, peering at the mechanism. She had watched her father, a watchmaker, work with similarly intricate devices for years. She saw a small pin that had slipped from its housing, wedged against a gear. "There," she said, pointing with a numb finger. "That pin. It's out of place. You have to reset it before you force the handle, or you'll strip the gear." He stopped and looked, his eyes narrowing. He had been so focused on the main lever that he had missed the small, crucial detail. He grunted, a sound of reluctant acknowledgement. He tried to reach the pin with his thick, gloved fingers, but they were too clumsy. "Let me," she said. She pulled off her own thin gloves, her bare fingers immediately stinging in the frigid air. With a delicacy born of long observation, she reached into the icy mechanism and, with a careful twist, worked the small pin free and guided it back into its proper place. "Now try," she said, her teeth beginning to chatter. He looked at her red, raw fingers, and for the first time, she saw a crack in his stoic facade. He took the handle and worked it gently. There was a soft click, and the mechanism engaged. With a groan of protesting metal, the pump began to work. He did not thank her. He simply looked at her for a long moment, then turned and went back to his work. But as she hurried back to the warmth of the cabin, she felt a subtle shift in the air. She had, in some small way, earned a piece of her place in this harsh world. Later that evening, while tidying a dusty trunk in a corner, she found it. Tucked beneath a stack of old linens was a small, crudely drawn picture of a smiling woman with a flower in her hair, signed in a child's scrawl, "Mama." And beside it, a tiny, carved wooden bird, its wings outstretched as if in mid-flight. She closed the trunk quickly, her heart aching with a sudden, sharp understanding of the silence that haunted this house. The trip to town was a necessity they could no longer avoid. The storm had depleted their supplies, and the rancher needed to purchase grain and other provisions that his land could not provide. The journey was made in the same tense silence as her arrival, but this time, the boy sat between them on the wagon bench. He did not lean against her, but she could feel the small warmth of his body, a fragile presence in the vast, cold landscape. The town, when they arrived, seemed to her a hostile and foreign place. The memory of her desperate arrival was still fresh, a raw wound she tried to conceal beneath a veneer of composure. As they stepped into the general store, a wave of warmth and the smells of coffee, leather, and dried goods washed over them. It felt like stepping into another world. The store was crowded, the townsfolk eager to restock after being snowed in. Their conversation stopped as the three of them entered. Eyes turned toward them, filled with a cold, calculating curiosity. She felt the weight of their stares, a physical pressure on her skin. She was the outsider, the stranger the rancher had brought back from the storm. Whispers rustled in the corners like dry leaves. A woman detached herself from a group near the counter and moved toward them. She was dressed in a fine wool coat trimmed with fur, a stark contrast to the worn, practical clothing of everyone else. Her face was sharp, her eyes missing any hint of warmth. She was the banker's wife, a woman whose wealth and position made her the unelected arbiter of the town's social order. "Well, now," she said, her voice carrying a false, honeyed sweetness that did not reach her eyes. She stopped in front of the rancher, but her gaze was fixed on the woman beside him, raking over her threadbare coat and mended dress with undisguised contempt. "I see you found yourself some help." The pause was deliberate, the insinuation as thick and suffocating as mud. "It's so hard to find good people these days, isn't it? Especially when one has to look in such desperate places." The woman felt a hot flush of shame and anger rise in her cheeks. She wanted to shrink away, to disappear, but she held her ground, lifting her chin and meeting the banker's wife's cruel gaze. The boy, sensing the tension, pressed closer to his father, his small hand clutching a fold of the rancher's heavy coat. The rancher had been studying a list in his hand, seemingly oblivious. Now he slowly folded the paper and tucked it into his pocket. He did not raise his voice. He did not look at the banker's wife. He simply took a half step forward, a small, almost imperceptible movement that placed him squarely between his new wife and her accuser. The store fell silent. He turned his head slowly, and his eyes, cold and hard as chips of granite, met those of the banker's wife. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, but it cut through the silence of the store like a razor. "She is my wife." It was a simple, declarative statement. He offered no explanation, no justification. He did not defend her or himself. He simply stated a fact, drawing a line in the sand that was as clear and absolute as a canyon's edge. He held the banker's wife's gaze for a heartbeat longer, a silent challenge that dared her to continue. The banker's wife's face tightened, her feigned sweetness curdling into open hostility. She had expected a denial, an embarrassed explanation. She had not expected this quiet, unshakable defiance. She opened her mouth to say something more, then seemed to think better of it. With a sniff of indignation, she turned on her heel and swept back to her circle of gossips, her fury a palpable thing. The rancher turned his back on her, his dismissal complete. He calmly went about his shopping, gathering his supplies as if nothing had happened. But the atmosphere in the store had changed. The fragile peace of their isolated existence had been shattered. They were no longer just a man, a woman, and a child in a remote cabin. They were a public spectacle, a subject for vicious speculation. The ride home was silent, but it was a different kind of silence now, heavy with unspoken things, with the warning shot that had been fired in the warm, crowded store. He had claimed her, defended her, and in doing so, had bound her to him in a way that no piece of paper ever could. That night, the silence in the cabin was heavier than ever before. The confrontation in the town had erected a new wall between them, one built of public scrutiny and unspoken questions. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, but it offered little warmth against the chill that had settled in the room. The boy was asleep in his loft, his quiet breathing a faint, rhythmic sound from above. The rancher sat at the table, cleaning a piece of tack with slow, methodical movements, his focus absolute, his face an unreadable mask. She could not bear it any longer. The uncertainty was a knot tightening in her chest. She stood by the fire, her hands clasped together, and finally broke the suffocating quiet. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why did you do that? In the store?" She took a breath, forcing herself to ask the question that had been haunting her since she first set foot in this place. "Why did you help me at all? You could have found anyone. You could have sent for a proper wife." He did not stop his work. For a long moment, she thought he would not answer, that he would retreat further into the fortress of his silence. The only sounds were the soft scrape of his knife against the leather and the hiss of the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough, as if dredged up from a deep, painful place. "I tried," he said, his eyes still fixed on his hands. After she was gone, I wrote letters, sent for a woman from the East. She lasted 2 weeks. Couldn't stand the quiet. Couldn't stand the emptiness." He finally looked up, and his gaze met hers across the dimly lit room. For the first time, she saw past the stoicism, past the hardness, and looked directly into the vast, aching grief he carried. "My first wife," she filled this place with noise. Singing, laughing, even her humming while she worked. It was the sound of this house. When she died, the silence she left behind was loud, deafening. He set the piece of leather down on the table. Then the boy, he went quiet, too. Went inside himself to a place I couldn't reach. The silence got worse. It was a sickness. I looked at you, standing in that street, and I saw you had your own silence. A different kind. I thought maybe 2 kinds of quiet could cancel each other out. Make a better kind of silence. A peaceable 1 inch. He looked toward the loft where his son slept. And I thought, maybe a woman's presence in the house would be enough to convince him it was safe to come back out. His confession hung in the air, a raw and vulnerable thing. It was not a declaration of affection, but something far more profound, an admission of shared brokenness. Her heart ached for him, for the silent boy, for the ghost of the woman who had once filled these walls with song. Moved by his honesty, she felt her own defenses crumble. She owed him the truth. She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out the small, tarnished silver locket. She held it out to him in the palm of her hand. "I was not just poor," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I was running. My father was a merchant. He made a bad deal with a powerful man in the city, a man who lends money and collects debts with interest. My father lost everything. When he died, this man claimed the debt fell to me." She opened the locket. One side was empty, the picture long gone. The other held a tiny, crushed portrait of a young woman who looked like her. "He did not want money. He wanted me. He said I was an asset listed on the contract. He saw me as property. I ran before he could collect." The rancher stood and walked over to her. He did not take the locket, but he looked down at it, his expression grim. The story transformed their situation entirely. The threat was no longer just the town's prejudice or the harshness of the land. It was a specific man, a tangible danger that could track her here. He had offered her a roof, a shield from the cold. Now he realized he had to offer her a fortress, a defense against the corrupt world she had fled. He looked from the broken locket to her face, and his gaze was no longer that of a stranger or a benefactor. It was the look of a protector. They were no longer just 2 lonely people sharing a roof. They were allies, bound by shared grief and a common enemy. Spring arrived as a slow, hesitant thaw. The iron grip of winter loosened, and the land began to breathe again. Patches of green appeared on the hillsides, and the air, for the first time in months, carried the scent of damp earth instead of ice. A fragile sense of peace settled over the small homestead. The woman planted a small garden near the cabin, her hands sinking into the rich soil with a feeling of profound gratitude. The boy, Cody, began to spend his days with her, following her as she worked, his silence now more companionable than watchful. Sometimes, she would catch him mouthing a word, practicing in secret, and her heart would fill with a cautious, painful hope. The rancher watched them, a quiet approval in his eyes. The house was slowly becoming a home. The peace was shattered on a bright afternoon in late May. A fine, polished carriage, utterly out of place in the rugged landscape, made its way up the track to the homestead. It was drawn by two sleek black horses that looked as though they had never seen a muddy road. The woman was outside, hanging laundry on a line, when she saw it. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, seized her. She knew, with a certainty that stole the breath from her lungs, who had come. A man stepped out of the carriage. He was impeccably dressed in a dark city suit, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. He was handsome in a cruel, predatory way, with a smile that did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. It was him, the man from the city. The rancher came out of the barn, a pitchfork still in his hand, and stopped, his body tensing. The boy, who had been playing near the porch steps, ran to the woman and hid behind her skirts, his small hands clutching her dress. "A charmingly rustic scene," the man from the city said, his voice smooth and laced with condescension as he surveyed the small cabin and its inhabitants. He looked at the woman, his eyes lingering on her in a way that made her feel soiled. "I have to admit, I didn't expect to find you in a place like this. But then, you always were resourceful." He turned his attention to the rancher. "I am here to collect my property." "She is not your property," the rancher said, his voice a low growl. He took a step forward, placing himself between the man and the woman and child. The man from the city laughed, a dry, unpleasant sound. "Oh, but she is." Legally and bindingly from his coat, he produced a folded document. A contract of debt, signed by her father. "It clearly states that in the event of default, all his assets transfer to me. And she, my dear man, was listed as his most valuable asset." He held out the paper. "I have already spoken with the local lawman. He agrees the document is unorthodox, but legally sound in this territory. You have two choices. You can pay me the outstanding sum, a rather significant amount, I assure you. Or you can step aside." He smiled his chilling smile. "I will give you 3 days to find the money. After that, I will return with the law to claim what is mine." He folded the document, placed it back in his coat, and climbed back into his carriage without another word. As the carriage turned and drove away, a cloud of dust settled over the new green grass, tainting the clean spring air. The ultimatum hung between them, a death sentence for the fragile life they had begun to build. That night, the cabin was a war room. The lantern on the table cast a pool of harsh light on the faces of the man and woman, their expressions grim. The debt contract lay between them, its elegant script mocking them with its authority. The sum demanded was impossible, an amount the rancher could not raise in a lifetime. "There has to be a way," the woman said, her voice tight with desperation. She stared at the paper, her mind racing. She had a keen intellect, a sharp eye for detail honed by years of watching her father manage his ledgers. She scanned the document again and again, searching for a flaw, a loophole. "The signature, my father's signature, looks right. But this seal," she pointed to an embossed stamp at the bottom. "The Westward Expansion Trading Company. I have never heard of it." He did business with established firms. The rancher stared at the name, a flicker of something in his memory. His life before this ranch, before his first wife, was a part of his past he never spoke of. He had worked the telegraph lines for the railroad, a job that had taken him across the country and put him in contact with all manner of men and enterprises. "There's a man," he said slowly, his voice distant. "A clerk in the territorial capital. He owes me a favor. He has access to the central business registry." It was a long shot, a desperate gamble based on a half-forgotten name on a piece of paper. But it was the only shot they had. The next morning, before the sun had risen, he rode his fastest horse into town. He sent a long, detailed telegraph to the clerk in the capital, requesting any and all information on the Westward Expansion Trading Company and its proprietor, the man from the city. He used a simple code they had used years ago, a relic from his former life. Then came the agonizing wait. 2 days passed in a haze of tense silence and frantic, useless preparations. They barely slept, starting at every sound, every shadow. The boy seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, staying close to the woman, his small face etched with a fear that mirrored her own. On the morning of the 3rd day, the polished carriage appeared again at the end of the track. This time, it was followed by a man on horseback, the town marshal, his face set in a grim, reluctant expression. Behind him, Riding in a small buggy was the banker's wife, her face alight with vindicated triumph, eager to witness the final humiliation. The rancher and the woman stood on the porch, a united front against the coming storm. The boy stood between them, holding the woman's hand in one of his and the rancher's in the other, his small body a fragile bridge between them. The man from the city stepped down from his carriage, a smug, proprietary air about him. "Time is up," he announced. "Marshal, I believe you have a duty to perform." The marshal dismounted, his reluctance clear. "I'm sorry," he said, his eyes on the rancher. "The paper seems legal. I have to enforce it." Just as the marshal took his first step toward the porch, another rider appeared, galloping hard from the direction of town. It was the young man from the telegraph office, his horse lathered in sweat. He reined in sharply, leaped from the saddle, and ran toward the rancher, waving a yellow piece of paper. "This just came through," he panted. "Marked urgent." The rancher took the telegram. A profound silence fell over the yard, broken only by the heaving breaths of the horse. The man from the city's smug expression wavered, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. The rancher unfolded the paper and began to read aloud, his voice clear and steady, carrying across the still morning air. "Westward Expansion Trading Company," he read, "not a registered entity. No legal standing. Proprietor," he looked directly at the man from the city, "is wanted in 3 eastern territories for fraud, embezzlement, and forgery. Known for creating fictitious companies to press false debt claims. Consider this man armed and dangerous. A federal warrant is being transmitted to your regional office." The color drained from the city man's face. The contract in his hand was worthless, a piece of elaborate fiction. The marshal's head snapped up, his expression of reluctance replaced by one of cold, hard duty. He looked from the telegram to the swindler, his hand moving instinctively to the pistol at his hip. "Well," the marshal said, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. "It seems we have a different legal matter to attend to." He drew his weapon. "You are under arrest." The swindler made a desperate move for the carriage, but the marshal was faster. In moments, the finely dressed man was in handcuffs, his smug confidence utterly shattered, replaced by raw, sputtering panic. The banker's wife, her face a mask of horrified disbelief and public humiliation, yanked on her buggy's reins and fled without a word. The marshal tipped his hat to the rancher. "Looks like you had your affairs in order after all," he said with a newfound respect. He shoved his prisoner toward his horse, and they rode away, leaving the field to the victors. The spring that followed was a time of quiet healing. The violent intrusion of the outside world had, paradoxically, solidified the fragile bonds of the family on the homestead. The cloud of fear that had hung over them was gone, replaced by the warm, clear light of a secure future. The land itself seemed to rejoice, bursting forth with a riot of wildflowers and deep, green grass. The air was soft, filled with the hum of bees and the distant lowing of cattle. The homestead began to transform. The woman's garden flourished, producing rows of vibrant vegetables. She hung simple, handmade curtains in the windows of the cabin, their cheerful color softening the starkness of the logs. The scent of baking bread and simmering stews now permanently perfumed the air, chasing away the last ghosts of stale grief. It was no longer just a shelter, it was a home, infused with her care and her quiet, resilient spirit. The rancher, too, was a changed man. The deep lines of sorrow around his eyes seemed to have lessened. He began a new project, laying the foundation for an addition to the cabin, a new, larger room. The rhythmic sound of his hammer and saw became a part of the daily music of the homestead, a sound of construction, of building a future. The expansion was a physical manifestation of the growth in his own heart, a symbol of making space for the new life that had taken root there. He started to talk more, not in long speeches, but in small observations about the weather or the cattle, sharing the details of his day. He would watch her work in the garden, a soft, unfamiliar expression on his face. He was no longer just a solitary man occupying a space. He was a husband and a father, participating in the soft sounds of a life being lived. But the greatest transformation was in the boy. With the threat to his new mother vanquished, the final lock on his voice seemed to break. It started with a single word, a whispered "more" at the dinner table one night that made both adults freeze in astonishment. Soon, a trickle of words became a stream, then a river. He chattered as he followed the woman through her chores, asking 1,000 questions about the world. He laughed, a bright, clear sound that filled the cabin and echoed across the fields. The heavy silence that had defined him for so long was gone, replaced by the boundless, joyful noise of a child who felt safe and loved. One evening, he sat on the floor by the fire, watching her mend one of his shirts. He looked up at her, his dark eyes serious. "Are you my mama now?" he asked, the question simple and direct. She stopped her sewing, a lump forming in her throat. She looked at him, at his earnest, hopeful face, and her heart swelled with a love so fierce it almost hurt. "Yes, Cody," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I am." He smiled, a wide, radiant smile that lit up his whole face, and went back to his playing, the matter settled with the beautiful finality of a child's faith. The story ended not with a dramatic climax, but with a quiet, perfect moment some months later, as summer was giving way to the golden haze of early autumn. The rancher had finished the new room, and he had built a sturdy porch swing. As the sun began to set, casting long, peaceful shadows across the valley, the three of them sat on it together. The boy, tired from a day of play, was curled asleep in the woman's lap, his head resting against her heart. The rancher gently pushed the swing with his boot, its slow, rhythmic creak a soothing lullaby. He put his arm around her shoulders, drawing her close. She leaned her head against him, a gesture of complete trust and belonging. They sat in a comfortable, contented silence, watching the last sliver of the sun dip below the mountains. The silence was no longer empty or loud with grief. It was full of peace, full of promise, full of the quiet, unshakable certainty of a family that had found its home.